5 countries, 3.2 billion people, 40% of the world's population, and they just launched a financial weapon that could end the dollar's 80-year reign as the world's reserve currency. You have heard the name BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But what you have not heard is what they are actually building and why it terrifies Washington more than any military threat ever could. In January 2024, BRICS launched the unit, a gold-backed digital currency designed to settle international trade without touching the US dollar or the SWIFT banking system. Oil from Russia, minerals from South Africa, manufacturing from China, all traded in a currency that bypasses American financial control entirely. This is not a competitor. This is a parallel financial universe, and it is growing faster than anyone predicted. Here is what nobody is telling you. The dollar's dominance was never about economics. It was about force, military bases in 80 countries, the ability to freeze $300 billion in foreign reserves overnight, the power to cut any nation off from global banking with a single sanction. But that power only works as long as everyone needs dollars. And BRICS just created a system where they do not. The world is not heading toward a multipolar financial system. It is already here. And if you think this does not affect you, wait until you see what happens to your savings, your mortgage, and your retirement when the dollar loses its privileged position. Before we break down the biggest geopolitical shift in modern history, hit that subscribe button and join the Wealth Forum. We expose the financial earthquakes, reshaping global power before they destroy your wealth. Turn on notifications. What comes next will change how you see the entire world economy. Now let's talk about how we got here, and why BRICS is not just another economic alliance. It is a declaration of independence from American financial hegemony. Let's go back to 1944. Bretton Woods, World War II is ending, Europe is destroyed. Asia is devastated, and America emerges as the only major economy with its infrastructure intact. In that moment, the United States makes a deal with the world. The dollar will be backed by gold, and every other currency will be pegged to the dollar. Global trade will flow through dollars, and America will guarantee stability. This was not charity. This was the foundation of American empire. Control the currency. Control the world. For 27 years, this system worked. Until 1971, that is when Richard Nixon did something unprecedented. He ended the gold standard. No warning, no negotiation. Just a unilateral decision that the dollar would no longer be redeemable for gold, and the world had no choice but to accept it. But Nixon was not stupid. He knew he needed a new anchor. So in 1973, the United States struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. America would provide military protection. Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil in dollars, and every other OPEC nation would follow. Suddenly, every country on earth needed dollars again. Not to buy gold, to buy energy. The petrodollar was born, and American financial dominance was secured for another 50 years. Here is the dirty secret. The dollar's value is not backed by economic strength. It is backed by dependency. As long as the world needs dollars to buy oil, to trade internationally, to store reserves, America can print unlimited money and export the inflation to everyone else. This is called exorbitant privilege, and it has allowed the United States to run massive deficits for decades, without consequences. But empires built on dependency have a fatal flaw. The moment the dependency breaks, the empire collapses. And that moment is happening right now. In 2023, China settled 70% of its oil purchases in yuan. Russia and China signed a $400 billion energy deal entirely outside the dollar system. Saudi Arabia let the petrodollar agreement expire in 2024 after 51 years. And BRICS launched the unit as a gold-backed alternative to the dollar. The cracks are not forming. The cracks are already here. And they are widening faster than most people realize. Now let's talk about the mechanics. What exactly is BRICS? How does the unit work? And why is this the most serious threat to dollar dominance in history? BRICS started in 2009 as a loose economic forum. Brazil, Russia, India, China, 4 major developing economies looking for cooperation. South Africa joined in 2010. For years, it was mostly symbolic, trade discussions, development banks, nothing that threatened the existing order. But in 2023, everything changed. BRICS expanded. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Suddenly, BRICS was not just developing nations. It was oil producers. It was manufacturing powerhouses. It was 40% of global GDP. And more importantly, it was nations that had been sanctioned, threatened, or economically pressured by the United States. They had a common enemy and a common goal: financial independence. Here is how the unit works. It is a digital currency backed 40% by gold and 60% by a basket of BRICS currencies. This is not cryptocurrency. This is not speculation. This is a state-backed settlement system with tangible value. When Russia sells oil to China, instead of converting rubles to dollars to yuan, they settle directly in the unit. No dollars needed, no SWIFT required, no American oversight. Think of it like this. Imagine you and your neighbors all use the same landlord's currency to trade with each other. The landlord controls the supply. The landlord sets the rules. The landlord can freeze your account anytime. Now imagine you and your neighbors create your own currency, backed by gold you actually own. The landlord cannot control it, cannot freeze it, cannot devalue it. That is what BRICS just did on a global scale. The unit solves three problems simultaneously. First, sanctions immunity. The United States froze $300 billion in Russian reserves in 2022, but dollars held as unit cannot be frozen by Washington. They are outside US jurisdiction. Second, inflation protection. The unit is 40% backed by gold. Unlike the dollar, which can be printed infinitely, the unit has tangible value that cannot be inflated away. Third, trade efficiency. Instead of converting through dollars, BRICS nations trade directly. This eliminates currency risk and reduces transaction costs. But here is the deeper strategy. BRICS is not trying to replace the dollar everywhere. They are targeting specific choke points: energy, commodities, manufacturing. These are the sectors where dollar dominance is most vulnerable. Russia produces 10% of global oil. Saudi Arabia produces 12%. If these nations price oil in the unit instead of dollars, the petrodollar collapses. And with it, one of the main reasons the world needs dollars. China is the world's largest manufacturer. If China starts invoicing in the unit, global supply chains shift away from dollars. Brazil is a commodity superpower. Iron, soybeans, coffee. If Brazil prices commodities in the unit, another pillar of dollar demand disappears. This is not about creating a new global reserve currency overnight. This is about erosion, death by 1,000 cuts. Every trade settled in the unit is one less trade that needs dollars. And the system is designed to grow. BRICS is actively recruiting new members: Indonesia, Turkey, Nigeria, Mexico. These are not small economies. These are major players. And every nation that joins strengthens the network effect. The more countries use the unit, the more valuable it becomes. The more valuable it becomes, the more countries join. This is the same network effect that made the dollar dominant, except now it is working against the dollar. Here is the part that should terrify American policymakers. BRICS does not need to convince everyone. They just need critical mass. If 30% of global trade moves to the unit, dollar demand drops by 30%. If dollar demand drops by 30%, the United States cannot run trillion-dollar deficits without triggering inflation. If the US cannot run deficits, the entire economic model breaks. The mechanics are simple. The implications are catastrophic. And the timeline is shorter than anyone wants to admit. Now let's talk about the crisis, the moment when BRICS stopped being a threat and became a reality, and what that means for American power. The turning point was not a single event. It was a cascade. And it started with sanctions. In 2014, the United States sanctioned Russia over Crimea. In 2018, sanctions hit Iran. In 2020, sanctions targeted China over Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And in 2022, the big one, Russia invades Ukraine, and the United States freezes $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. That freeze changed everything, because it proved something every developing nation suspected but nobody wanted to believe. US dollars held in reserves are not safe. They are hostages that can be seized at any moment for any reason. Washington decides is justified. Russia thought their foreign reserves were untouchable. They were wrong. And every other nation with dollar reserves watched and learned. China learned. China holds over $3 trillion in foreign reserves, much of it in US Treasuries. If tensions over Taiwan escalate, Washington could freeze China's reserves just like they did Russia's. That is not a theoretical risk. That is an existential threat. So China started converting, selling treasuries, buying gold, building alternatives, and accelerating BRICS. Saudi Arabia learned. For 50 years, Saudi Arabia priced oil in dollars because America guaranteed their security. But in 2022, when Saudi Arabia asked for support against Houthi attacks, the US hesitated. When Saudi Arabia wanted to normalize relations with Syria, the US objected. The relationship was fraying, and when the petrodollar agreement expired in 2024, the Saudis did not renew it. For the first time in 51 years, Saudi oil could be priced in any currency, including the unit. India learned. India is not an enemy of the United States, but India is pragmatic, and India saw Russia sanctioned, China threatened, and Iran isolated. India realized that dependency on the dollar is a vulnerability, so India joined BRICS not because they hate America, but because they want options, insurance, a plan B if Washington ever decides to use financial weapons against them. Here is the crisis. The United States weaponized the dollar, and in doing so, it destroyed the trust that made the dollar system work. For 80 years, holding dollars was considered safe, neutral, apolitical. But the 2022 sanctions shattered that illusion. Dollars are now seen as a geopolitical weapon, and countries are scrambling to reduce their exposure. The numbers tell the story. In 2001, the dollar made up 73% of global reserves. By 2024, it is down to 58%. That is a 15-point drop in 23 years, and the decline is accelerating. In 2023 alone, central banks bought 1,136 tons of gold, the most since 1950. They are not buying dollars anymore. They are buying gold, the same gold that backs the unit. But here is where it gets dangerous. The more countries de-dollarize, the weaker the dollar becomes. The weaker the dollar becomes, the more countries want to de-dollarize. It is a feedback loop, and it is already in motion. Every oil deal priced in yuan, every commodity trade settled in the unit, every central bank that sells treasuries and buys gold. Each one accelerates the decline, and the United States cannot stop it. Sanctions do not work on a bloc as large as BRICS. You cannot sanction 40% of global GDP without destroying your own economy. Military force is not an option. You cannot invade your way to currency dominance, and economic incentives only work if you are still the dominant player. But if BRICS keeps growing, the incentives shift. Countries will choose the unit not because they hate the dollar, but because everyone else is using it. This is the crisis. Not a war, not a collapse, but a slow, deliberate, irreversible shift in global power. And it is happening right now. In trade agreements you do not see. In currency swaps you do not hear about. In bilateral deals that quietly bypass the dollar system one transaction at a time. The empire is not falling. It is being dismantled, brick by brick, trade by trade. And most Americans have no idea it is happening. Now let's talk about the consequences. What happens when the dollar loses its reserve status? And what does it mean for you? Here is what happens when the dollar loses reserve currency status. First, inflation explodes. Right now, when the Federal Reserve prints money, much of that inflation is exported to the rest of the world. Why? Because global demand for dollars absorbs the excess supply. But if the world stops needing dollars, that demand disappears. And all the inflation we have been exporting comes home. Let's put numbers to this. The United States has printed over 8 trillion since 2020. That money is sitting in global reserves, in foreign central banks, in international trade. If BRICS succeeds and global dollar demand drops by 30%, that is 2.4 trillion in excess dollars flooding back into the US economy. That is not gradual inflation. That is hyperinflation. Groceries doubling, housing tripling, your savings cut in half in real terms within years. Second, interest rates skyrocket. The United States borrows $2 trillion per year to fund deficits. Right now, foreign buyers absorb much of that debt. China, Japan, Europe. They buy treasuries because they need dollars. But if they do not need dollars, they do not need treasuries. So who buys the debt? The Federal Reserve, which means printing more money, which means more inflation. Or the US has to offer higher interest rates to attract buyers. Much higher. We are talking 8, 10, 12% interest rates on government debt. And when government borrowing costs rise, so does everything else. Mortgages, car loans, credit cards. The entire economy slows to a crawl. Third, living standards collapse. The American middle class has been subsidized by dollar dominance for 80 years. Cheap imports from China, low inflation despite massive money printing, the ability to consume more than we produce. All of this was possible because the world needed dollars. But when that ends, Americans have to live within their means. That means lower consumption, higher prices, declining quality of life, and a generation that is poorer than their parents for the first time in modern history. Fourth, global power shifts. The United States has used financial sanctions over 9,000 times since 2001 against Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Syria. And sanctions only work because the world uses dollars. But if the unit becomes a viable alternative, sanctioned nations just switch systems. America's most powerful geopolitical weapon becomes useless. And with it goes the ability to enforce foreign policy without military force. Fifth, the BRICS bloc rises. Right now, BRICS accounts for 40% of global GDP. But if the unit succeeds, that number will grow, because countries will join not for ideology, but for economics. If you can trade freely with 40% of the world, economy without dollars, why stay dependent on a system that can freeze your assets any time? The network effect kicks in, and BRICS becomes the dominant economic bloc of the 21st century. And here is the most unsettling consequence. There is nothing the United States can do to stop it. Sanctions make it worse by proving why countries need alternatives. Military threats push nations toward BRICS for protection. Economic incentives do not work when you are no longer the biggest market. The only option is reform, and reform means giving up the exorbitant privilege, which means massive spending cuts, which means economic pain, which means political suicide. So instead of reforming, the system will try to maintain the status quo for as long as possible. Print more money, issue more debt, ignore the warnings, until one day the market forces a reckoning, and by then it will be too late to manage the decline. It will be a collapse. This is not fear-mongering. This is the inevitable consequence of a system built on dependency facing an alternative, built on sovereignty. And history shows us what happens next. The empire that refuses to adapt dies. Every single time. So here is the lesson. BRICS is not a competitor. It is a revolt against 80 years of financial dominance, a revolt against a system where one nation controls the money that everyone else uses, a revolt against sanctions as foreign policy. And it is succeeding because it offers something the dollar system cannot: independence. The shocking truth behind BRICS' economic power is not military might. It is not ideology. It is simply this: they do not need the dollar anymore. And once you do not need the dollar, you do not need to follow American rules. You do not need to absorb American inflation. You do not need to fear American sanctions. You are free. The question is not whether BRICS will replace the dollar. The question is how fast, and whether the United States can adapt to a world where it is no longer the financial hegemon. Because if history teaches us anything, it is this: empires that cling to power lose it violently. Empires that adapt to change survive. Right now, America is clinging, and the world is moving on without it. So here is what you do. If this video changed how you see the global financial order, if it made you realize the dollar's dominance is ending and BRICS is not a joke, then smash that like button. Subscribe to the Wealth Forum, turn on notifications. Share this with anyone who still thinks the dollar is untouchable, because the next video breaks down exactly how to protect your wealth when the dollar loses reserve status. And you do not want to miss it. But before you go, leave a comment. Tell me this: do you think the United States can adapt? Or is the empire already in terminal decline? Because I want to know if you think there is a way out of this, or if we are just watching the slow-motion collapse of American financial hegemony. The BRICS economic power is not shocking because it is strong. It is shocking because it is working, and the world is already choosing sides.